We're here with Pernille, and the slide we're looking at says the corporate problem. Perhaps it's the corporate opportunity. And there's a lot of talk, a lot of research around how all companies in this day and age are looking to reinvent or improve and optimize existing ways of managing people performance, reviews. There's a lot of old technology, there's a lot of new technology, and luckily, perhaps it's been more easy than ever before to get it done the way it makes sense for the company. So with Pernille today, we're going to look at some different considerations, some different possibilities. And I think Pernille kicking it off and saying, if it's true that there's 79% of executives that are right now considering reinventing the performance management, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree that I think a lot of people, a lot of both executives and also HR professionals are looking at what they currently have and evaluating whether that meets the purpose and the goals of the certain process or platform. Because like you said, there are many new ways of how you can combine different processes, and we get even more data both on our employees, but also on performance on other aspects. And to be able to combine those in a smart way gives a lot of opportunities. But there are also pitfalls in this. And that is when we look at some of our processes and how we've designed them, do they then actually meet what we intended them to do? And I think that's why a lot of executives are currently looking at what they have, because we've designed a lot of processes, a lot of platforms and so on, but do they actually give us the data that we need? So can we rely on the output? And there I think we need to look at what is it we want from a certain process, what is the goal with having this process, what should it enable us to do, and then figure out how should it then be designed. So I think there are definitely room for improvement, and you could also see some companies, some industries throwing away performance management, some taking it in even more. So right now we are in this area, you could say, or times where things are actually changing, and you see a lot of different ways on how to do this.
Yes, and I think the other thing that has always been, at least the headlines that I have been seeing, is that HR's role in this whole game and their ability to guide executives and leadership teams and managers with better information is perhaps increasingly the most important thing now. And so I think in this conversation, we would like to try and also see how is it actually possible to design a process where you can yield interesting information for different purposes and different goals and objectives. So that's something I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on, particularly this whole thing. Is it actually possible to design a process that encompasses both the overview of performance and will also give a clear overview of talent pools available? Because I think that's the two topics that are hot. And so how do you actually do that? And that would be interesting for us to expand on now.
Well, I think in that sense, you could say that throughout the recent years, we've designed numerous both talent and performance processes, but some of them has been very much focused on the individual and the employee and how to create engagement and motivation, whereas I think the other factor of also looking at business performance has become increasingly important. And that is why one of my key elements in designing new processes is that HR needs to not only understand how to build engagement and motivation and design good leadership processes, but HR also needs to understand the business, the goals of the business, and how the business runs. because only then I think it's possible to get, like you say, this overview of talent pool, and figure out how is it we look at a talent, and how is it we define performance. And I think sometimes we start a bit too early by saying, oh, we also need this process, or we could also do this. But if we all the time stick to why are we doing it, what value does it create to the business and to the employees and to the leadership, then I think it becomes really forceful. And then I think we can, by combining different steps or processes, yes, we can get that overview, but we need to start maybe a bit different than we had done before, where we say we want a process that gives us this. Now I think we need to start looking at from a business perspective even more than we've done before.
Yeah. So why don't we actually take a look at what that would look like in practical terms, because I think everyone is always wanting to see, well, how do you then conduct that? Mm-hmm. And I appreciate now that we are going to go into to a solution to take a look at this. It of course assumes that people will have know what happened in the background, and there's no doubt that the design phase is crucial. So perhaps you can give us a little bit of flavor here as an example where we're looking at a framework for how people could be taken through a process.
Well, what I think is important when looking at the process, and once we have defined, what is it we want this process to do, how should it be linked to other business processes, then I think the use and feel of the process is extremely important. I think if you go back 5-10 years, you would spend a lot of training in teaching managers how to do these processes. As I see it now, it should be something that is, if not self-explanatory, then close to, because the leaders know the look and feel, it is intuitive, and it's easy for them to see, why am I doing this? So they can see that they're doing it to improve on their business and their department, their goals, and the satisfaction and motivation in their department. And therefore it becomes something that they want to work in and something that they are curious. Whereas if it comes with a lot of tutorials and trainings and big setup, then sometimes it can seem like, okay, this is something I also need to do besides my other things. I very much want these types of processes to be a natural part of the leadership behavior and something you do when you practice good leadership.
Yes. The thing that will be interesting to just understand now that we are looking at actual application to achieve if it is actually possible to encompass both the overview of performance, but also the understanding of the talent pool. What we're looking at here is, of course, some employees, and it could be 500, it could be 3,000, and of course all these are grouped into their respective departments and so forth. But what I'd like to try and do is to have you help us talk through an example of an employee here. In this case, it's going to be employee number 10. But before we click on this person, I'd like you to just give us a little bit of flavor of the journey up here, where we have evaluation, manager preparation, employee preparation, one-to-one, and then the development plan.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it should be easy working with people development, and by having these steps, it becomes quite intuitive. I think also what it is you need to do. So the steps you have here is you have an evaluation step where you would look at the employee, either in terms of performance or in terms of performance and potential. That can vary depending on, again, the purpose and the goal of the process. So you have an evaluation step where you also have the possibility of discussing your employees with your peers, with your leader peers, which I think can be quite forceful, because words can be interpreted in different ways. And when we come to a ranking, what I believe is solid performance may not be the same as my colleague. So I think the discussion in the management team, quantifying, qualifying what do we mean and how do we assess our employees is very forceful, and that can be done in the evaluation step. Then there is a step for the manager where he or she can prepare, set up more individual goals and say, I think I would like you to evaluate you on these points. Maybe you have some predefined competencies that are relevant to a specific profile. And also you can set goals for the coming period. So the manager has an individual preparation step, which is again, something you can do without a lot of training. It guides you through it quite easily, and it's something you can do in the different platforms you're working in. And then once you have done that, it will be forwarded, or it will be sent to the employee, who can then also do a preparation. And I think that is a good step, because I think it's actually quite important that, of course, the leader should support the individual development, but to me it's very essential that the employee also takes responsibility for his or her own development. And I think that is what we can help see to in the employee preparation, that the employee can reflect on the comments made by the manager, can also prepare on what is it I want to discuss in our meeting, and how do I see myself performing. So that step to me is quite crucial, actually. I know some has only a manager preparation and then the dialogue, but I very much like the employee preparation to create ownership and accountability on the employee side. Then you have the development dialogue, where you either sit together or have a physical or an online meeting, where you get to discuss these things. And because both have prepared, you're not feeling like you're trapped into a discussion. You are prepared and you're ready to have a good discussion on how am I performing, what are to come in the next quarter, or depending on how often you have these meetings. And then, of course, we want some outcome of the development dialogue as well, and that is then the development plan. So once we've had the discussion and we talked about how is the status of performance, and what is it you want to do more of or less of, then also making a plan. And I think going back 5 or 10 years, a plan was sometimes 7 pages long, and you had to type it in Word, and you never got to look at it before you had your appraisal the next year around. So now I think also making the plan quite focused. You pinpoint a number of areas you would like to work with, set some deadlines, and then it automatically becomes part of the employee's dashboard or the leader's dashboard, so that you're able to follow up as you go along, and it's not something you have to set aside time to go into, and now I need to follow up on my development dialogue. It should come quite natural to you when visiting the site, also for other learning purposes. You should be able to see, I need to follow up on this point. Maybe I need feedback from my manager. Maybe I need sparring from other colleagues, but it should be something that becomes part of everyday life and not an annual cycle.
Yes. Very interesting, and I think companies can, of course, design these journey steps to have either more or fewer and so forth. And I guess we can both perhaps agree that that's really about ultimately the company's own way as to how they want to go about doing it. I.e., we also know that there are some companies that want HR to approve certain steps before it can proceed and so forth.
Yeah, and whether you have the in the evaluation, whether you use these review meetings or discussion boards, or that is also different from company to company. And sometimes it can also depend on the maturity in the organization, because if you're used to talking about performance, if you're used to giving feedback, then it can be a natural step to have that. But if you have not done anything like this before, maybe you should start off by saying you will do an individual preparation, the employee will do a preparation, you will have a meeting, and then the next time around you can add different flavors, or you can get feedback from the organization in terms of maybe we can add another aspect to the process. So yes, I would say you could rather start it off simple and then add more as you go along, than to come in with a big process if you have an organization that hasn't done it before. That would be my advice.
Yeah. Okay, so let's try and actually have a look at the flow. Because obviously all of this sounds wonderful, but how does it actually happen in practical terms? But for the viewer and the listener here, I think it's important to just give them a little bit of background on this particular screen we're looking at here, where we're looking in this example of development zones and performance. And of course, it has to be said that what we're trying to give a feel for is this whole thing about encompassing both the performance and the talent pool overview. So are you able to give us a little bit of a flavor as to, because I know that there's a lot of mixed opinions and feelings about this whole grid thing, the 9-box grid, you know, a grid that has existed for many years and is either loved or hated, or you know, what is the value of this grid, and how can you apply this to achieve these two important pieces inside one journey?
Well, I think for sure there is value both in the grid and also in doing a rating. First of all, you could say, we talked about initially about the executive and the top management wanting an overview of the organization and the talent pool. And second of all, to get an overview of performance also in your department. So I would say that yes, both are important. What I find is the key element in also doing this and bringing it to life is to have some words and definitions that fit your organization. So it becomes natural way of articulating and talking about this. So as you can see here, there are also definitions. So when we say that you are at a 2, which is developed within role, what does that then mean? And I think that is very important, because if you don't have the definition below, then it can be very subjective. What do I mean with develop within role, and what do you mean? So having the opportunity to actually read a little bit about what does it mean, and then to also write a comment for the evaluation. And then if you have a step with the review meetings where you discuss with your peers, then this would be natural also to discuss with them when you talk about a certain employee and the evaluation, to get input and feedback, for instance, on projects and so on. How do your leader colleagues see the performance of your employee? And the same go for the performance, where you also have the possibility of easily making your mark and saying how do you perform in this given context. And again, the definition, I would say, is very important here, and also figuring out what fits our organization. So maybe the numbers here in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 should only be for leadership use. So it should only be something that is part of the leader's preparation and something you talk about when you have your review meetings with the managers. Because maybe, and that is one of the critiques that the grid has been given, that operating with these numbers from an employee perspective may not necessarily create that much engagement and motivation. What does it bring me to know that I'm a 3 and not a 4? Whereas the wording underneath, that is what is interesting. That is what can make me grow in my role, or make me aspire for more. So I would say that whether you should include the numbers, that is also a discussion to have in your design phase. Then there is here also the marking of talent and critical role. And I would say the definition of talent is something that is always a discussion point. When is somebody a talent? Some say you can't define a talent, but you know it when you see it. My argument would be that you can define a talent, but I think it's very depending on the company. So I don't think you can make a generic definition of talent. I think you would really need to look into your company DNA and also business plans and say, what is it we need from our talents to be able to define that? Because if you've then marked somebody as either a talent or a critical role, once you're done with your process, you can actually start getting an overview of where is it we have somebody in the organization we need to pay attention to, or where is it we need to think about succession planning and so on. So the notion of being able to make this mark is quite important, but it either needs to be facilitated or it needs to be defined, because otherwise, you know, what will come out of it, you won't be able to use that data after all, because it will be my evaluation of a talent and yours and so on. So I think before bringing these two steps into use, you would really need to articulate in your organization, what is a talent, what is a critical role, and how are we actually going to use the outcome afterwards. So once we have this overview saying that we have 20 talents or 40 critical roles, then what? Because if we're not going to do anything about it, then we shouldn't mark it. So yeah.
That's interesting. And in extension to this, in this example we are looking at here, the grid is of course populated with definitions. And for viewers and listeners, you know, at the bottom left here we're having the PEEP performance improvement plan, and diagonally all the way up to the top right, we have accelerated development plan. So what would be the value of these definitions in here and in the afterplay as the process continues?
Yeah. Here you could see that there are 3 kinds of development plans. So if you're in the lower left-hand corner, you would get this personal improvement plan with the abbreviation PIP. And if you're in the middle, you will get a development plan. And if you're in the top, you'll get the accelerated development. So here there is a differentiation of plans. And I would say you can go with one plan. If it's the first time you do it, what's most important is that you have some sort of outcome in terms of a plan. But the bigger the organization get, and also to accommodate with lifting low performance as well as focusing on high performance, it can be a good idea to have different plans for different steps or different plans for different performance ratings. So the improvement plan, the focus there is typically to lift the employee and to focus on what does it take to make sure that you deliver as expected and that you are engaged and motivated in your current job. Whereas the development plan also focuses on giving you additional tasks, maybe new projects, working in new forums, so you are all the time expanding your horizon, learning new things. And finally, the accelerated development plan would then often be somebody who is also marked as a high performer or somebody we need to pay attention to. And the accelerated development, what that means is there would typically be even more focus on new initiatives, new things, and also looking at how can we use the potential of this person in a broader context than we do today. So by having these different plans, hopefully the employee can also see that if you are highly ranked, then we also make sure to let you know that we have focus on you and that you get extra development, so to say. So I think it can be good to have the definition or different development plans, but again, you need to think about what it is you want to achieve with it. Because if you don't use and have different focus on whether it's an improvement plan, a development plan, or an accelerated development plan, then my notion is then you should just have one development plan. But if you have different initiatives saying if it's an improvement plan, it is followed up more closely, it is defined in a different way, and the same goes for the acceleration plan. If you are able to have special attention on those and make different action depending on plan, then it makes great sense, I would say, to differentiate in plans. But it depends on what you're going to use it for, because you can build a lot of things into a process, but if you then don't use the outcome probably afterwards, you should really consider how complex a process you're going to build.
Yes. And I think the other thing I am thinking about is that as a manager or leader, and I'm now going to take my team through this process, I assume that by having some guidance from HR and some well thought through processes, when I then place somebody in here, whether that is the 100% accurate truth, what I will do is get some guidance around how I then facilitate the conversation. Because in this day and age, there's great leaders, there's young leaders, there's perhaps inexperienced leaders, and it also happens that perhaps there's maybe not so great leaders. So would you say that when I then submit this one, depending on what plan then comes, that then gives me guidance as to how I then go through the motions? We all know that it's great to have the systems and the processes and all that stuff, but everybody, we're human beings. We're hardwired to sit down and have a conversation of what we crave for.
Yeah. And I think definitely the guidelines and the fact that you know as a leader, okay, if I put my employee here, then it will automatically, give me the plan format, and I can start, discussing or talking to my employee about what will we then do. I think that's a key element, because some leaders are also reluctant, of course, to place their employees in the low performance, because it reflects back on them if they have a low performer. But if they know that the aim is not to pinpoint bad behavior, but it is to say, okay, there's somebody not meeting the requirements, he or she is not performing as expected, you will actually have the help and guidance in here to help him or she lift the performance. That is the focus point. It's not to pin out, bad behavior and make an example out of that, or talk about how to get rid of that person, because that is, to me, a completely different process. The process here has the goal of developing people, and therefore it should be seen as a guidance tool to do that. So I think that can help managers in saying, okay, I actually want to use the scale, because I know whether I put my employees in high or low, or I'm guided through, how do I have a good discussion with them about that, and how do I actually then, dive into where are they performing right now, and how can I help lift that, how can I help them grow.
Yeah, and I guess the screen we're looking at now is then saying, me as a manager or leader confirming whether I want to go with one plane or the other, another plane, despite that you were placed in somewhere else in the court, is the opportunity to override here. I guess people often are frustrated that it becomes more about the system and less about the humans.
Yeah.
So I guess in this example, saying, okay, it's still flexibility to say, despite that the system, based on how it was configured by corporate HR, can still give you flexibility to choose another plan.
And again, I would say that depends on the focus point of the process and the goal of the process, because if the goal of the process is to have an organization that have these dialogues on a frequent basis, and you just want to get that feedback going, then I think it's great that you're able to choose and say, okay, we just want you to have good conversations. But if you want to use the analytics and the data to also get an overview of the organization, then I think you need to be a little bit more firm in saying which ratings get which plan, because if you then want to filter out afterwards, can we see all who are having an improvement plan? And if leaders have not been consistent in choosing the plan format that goes with their rating, then you can build on the next step and say, okay, this rating gives this plan. So yeah, I think it depends on the goal of the process, and also the maturity of the company.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're looking at the manager preparation. So in this first phase here now, I have considered where I think you are as a human being, and as you correctly said, this is not about showing this to the employee. It can be, and you can choose not to. But the fact is that somebody has made a subjective opinion, which can then later on be used for different types of conversation with HR executives to understand the pool of people. But now it's actually about me and employee number 10. And now I'd like to begin to prepare myself for giving her some feedback in this scenario. And so I'd like to try and have you elaborate a little bit about this whole thing about how does a company today install and nurture and get the culture for giving feedback that they want to lead through their people. And so, for example, in this case here, there's an introduction section. There's also a video. Now, what is the value of this?
Well, I think that the purpose in terms of why are we doing this, I think it's very important, not only in these types of processes, but in general, because we have a lot of things to see to and a lot of things on our mind. And if we can't, figure out quite fast, why is it that this is relevant to me? Then it quickly becomes something that we are not, 100% focused on. So I think the way of doing a short introduction, maybe a video, having either one of the HR partners or even your CEO explain, why is this important? Why is it we want to do this? And how are we expecting you to work with it? I think that's actually quite forceful, and especially if it's coming from somebody in the senior management team, so that the leaders also know, okay, this is a tool for me to improve my leadership behavior, to get a high performing team. This is not just something HR wants me to do to tick off a number of boxes so we can say we're done. So the whole anchoring of the process is, to me, quite important. And here I think you can really use this first step in the manager preparation to kind of onboard the manager in that direction and tell him or her, this is a key step in being a good leader in our company, that you do this. So just spending the time to do a short, customized introduction at this stage, I think is well spent.
Yeah, and I would say that everybody these days talks about, the culture of a company and how do you actually build culture? And to me, I would say that culture is certainly built at the moment of truth, where leader and manager are having important conversations, whether it's about needed changes or any evaluation feedback and so forth. But the reality also is that it is hard to sometimes remember what is the culture, because we are so busy with the inboxes and the activities. So
yeah,
I would completely agree that this is perhaps the single most important thing, because here leadership of the business can signify back to other leaders that this is what we're trying to achieve here, and why it's so important that you come prepared into this conversation with another human being.
Yeah. And also I would say linking it to other aspects, for instance, the values of the organization. If you work with leadership programs or leadership competencies, linking it to that, so that you can see as a leader or an employee when working in the platform with the process, this is actually something that is linked to our organization, that fits our culture. They are using the same words as we use in our daily life. I think that is very important to get that integrated feel. Whereas if you just take words that you're not used to using, it can become a bit distant to you. So by using the time to actually, you know, get your own words massaged in, get your CEO or another good spokesperson to articulate how does this fit our culture, why do we do it, and why does it create also business impact. I think that is quite forceful.
Yes, for sure. And I also know that the whole notion about communication and involvement pre, during, and post these processes is something I don't know if we take it for granted that it just happens, but the reality is that it's often, okay, let's sit down and have a one-to-one, or now it's time to just give you some quick feedback on some stuff. So this whole thing about being in the right state of mind before going into it, I think is the key thing that will help build the culture and will help install that culture and protect it. But if you don't have these prompts, and if you don't change at a regular interval the video or refresh them so that they are coherent with where we are moving as a business, because the notion here is also, for example, that suddenly the new CEO comes in and there's a different tune in the company. What do you do then?
Yeah. And that's, I think that's very important point, that you make sure that the both the process and also the look and feel of the platform, that it changes with the flow of the organization, so that it doesn't seem outdated after one quarter where you feel like, I've seen this before, it was the same, or but we don't use that anymore, and then this is not relevant for me any longer. So being on the forefront of what is happening in the organization, how can we make sure that this is interesting and appealing also when doing it for the third or fourth time around? I think that is very important, and that's why it's good that the platform is so flexible and it's easy for you to go in and change the text, change a new video, and so on, because then it doesn't require, you know, days or months doing a small alteration. And these small alterations, I think that will just become part of everyday life. So the notion of where you before spent a year designing a big bang, you know, HR process platform, I think we go into saying, okay, of course we need something from the beginning, but then we will rather do these small increments and small steps where we change a little bit and we add new features, we change the video, we change the text, so that we all the time, you know, keep in line with the business, keep the momentum of the business. I think that is very important, rather than to do these long development phases with big bangs in the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and particularly in this day and age where, you know, the reality is that businesses has to be so much more agile and suddenly also adapt to a lot of new people coming in and out. In the old days, you know, we had people staying inside one company for years and years and years, but the influx of new people and only being in there in shorter amount of times will require that agility to be able to adapt faster.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then what we're looking at here in this example is then some different sections that has been built in to sort of facilitate this preparation. And here we're just looking at the feedback on performance. So of course this is following the flow recommended out of the plan. And I think maybe there's not so much to say here, except from, you know, the ability to write some qualified information in here in human words. So yeah, but I think one thing I'd like to talk to you a little bit about here is this next section about the competencies, because we all talk about capabilities, competencies. Do we have the right people in the right roles, and do they know these things that they should know in order to execute this strategy and so forth? So just for the listeners and the benefit in this solution here, there's a possibility to build up a whole arsenal of different types of competencies that can be dropped in to this evaluation process. And sometimes for some clients, they actually already have these things predefined to the job roles, so that when you come to the evaluation process, these things will automatically appear because they have been assigned to you as competencies, either a hard or soft, that is connected to your role. So perhaps give us a little bit of flavor of this part here.
I would say that the competencies or capabilities or what you decide to call it in your organization, I think the discussion of that has also changed a bit over the years, because before it was like a blank field here and you could go in as a manager and then choose some competencies you would like to discuss with the employee. And that can still be relevant, but if we want to use this to create performance in the right strategic direction, I think it's very forceful to have the opportunity to say, we want this group of people, for instance, sales, to focus on these 5 capabilities, or we want all in our customer service to focus on these capabilities. So it's not necessarily the same throughout the organization. It could depend on different groups. And I think the challenges in doing it the old way was that it was very much up to the individual manager and saying, okay, but we can add a little bit of, you need to do more of this, you need to do more of this, or maybe you need to elaborate your competences here. But if we can steer it a little bit more in terms of the strategic direction by actually using the opportunity to tag certain groups in either the platform or in our master data setup, where we can say we want these roles to get these competencies, then it's not up to the manager to decide on whether a salesperson should be evaluated on a certain sales competency, because that is something we've said, you know, to reach our strategic objectives and our goals, we need our sales staff to have this. So this is not something you could choose either to do or not do. You need to focus on this. So I think that's quite forceful to be able to do that and actually differentiate across groups, because of course sales needs to focus on different things than supply chain. So having that differentiation is a good thing, and it entails managers also to be able to use that in the dialogue. And then you could say you could also have some values in here that you have going for all, saying that we want all our employees to focus on teamwork. So that is again not something you can choose to focus on or not, because it's part of our DNA. It is something we want for all, no matter whether you're a manager or you are an employee. So the notion of setting up your organization in terms of competencies makes it quite both, I would say, easy for the manager, because he or she does not have to set a competence profile for each individual. That was what we did 5 years ago. Each employee had their own competence profile. Now I think it becomes more generic based on job role, and then you can add some flavor to that job role by saying, okay, I also need you to focus on your selling skills when encountering people over the phone or something like that. That can then be special for one person, whereas another person needs to focus on another thing. So here you actually have full flexibility, but you can still steer the organization in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that that's a key word, because the reality is that organizations would of course have long-term strategies, but more over today we see strategy execution in a shorter time period. And also if you suddenly need to have turnaround processes, or if you need to quickly steer, as you say, the organization in a specific direction, and you want to make sure that that's also covered right down through HR processes, because we know that it becomes sticky.
Yeah.
So that's a very, very powerful and very important thing to actually just consider for a moment. What infrastructure and what vehicles do we have in place that allows us to make sure we facilitate that necessary change? Or do we just rely on people remembering it at point of conversation?
Yeah, and I would say it also, another thing is that it also helps create the line of sight, which we work a lot with in strategy execution, is to create the line of sight from top priorities down to department goals and then down to individual goals. Yeah. So if me as an employee, if I can see how my goals are linked to the goals of the organization, to the goals of the department, then I'm more likely to do it, because I can see and I can understand why I need to do it. So
Yeah.
I would say this way of working with competencies or capabilities is also a way of creating that line of sight from employee to organization.
Yeah. And then one of my favorite things is, of course, that as an adult, mature leader, I appreciate that corporate HR has defined and designed the process, and I think it's wonderful. But let's say I have a different need. I need some more flexibility in this particular evaluation with this employee. And it might be that these things are sort of predefined, but pushing this button suddenly opens up a library of different types of skills and competencies that I can then choose from, because it might be that I have a specific project or a specific situation where I need to evaluate on something else. So
Exactly.
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and what I've said to the leaders I've worked with is be deliberate in your choices in here, because yes, there are a lot of competencies you can choose, and some would say, yeah, but then I would choose this and this and this, and they will tick it off because all of it is important. But I would rather say use these competencies here to focus on specific things and say, okay, I would like you to focus on this for the coming quarter, and then choose maybe in total no more than 6 competencies, 6 to 8 competencies. Because if we suddenly start working with 15, 20 competencies, it becomes a bit blurred again. So rather focus, tell your employees, I would like us for the next quarter to actually focus on the leadership and how you develop your colleagues and how you do that. And then let's push on that throughout the next quarter. And then when we meet again, hopefully we can look each other in the eyes and say, yeah, that really worked, that we focused on it, and now we can see that it has improved. And then maybe choose a different focus area for the coming quarter, so that you use it as focus points rather than the ability to, build an entire competence profile, because then it is that you have these many, many competencies, and it becomes a bit blurry, and also it becomes a big work for both the employee and the leader to follow up on and to guide and coach. So rather be deliberate in your choices here than choosing a lot, I would say.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that's sort of covering this whole thing, and as for everything else here, it's always important to substantiate a rating, like humanize this. I think we all probably agree it's actually not bad to get a rating, but we just like to know the why behind.
And I would say it also helps because when we looked at the process steps in the very beginning, there was this manager preparation, and then you had the employee preparation. So the employee will actually be able to see both the ratings on the competencies and also the comment. And I know some have been like, but isn't it a bit difficult to hand this over in writing? I would rather do it in the dialogue. And I would say, if you can choose here to write a good comment, it's actually also quite forceful for the employee to see what the leader has said, and also to be able to reflect upon that before the dialogue. Whereas if he or she does not see it before the dialogue, he have maybe not had the time to prepare on how is my perspective on this. So I would say that the notion of making a rating, commenting, and then sending it over to the employee as part of the process really again makes the employee accountable, because the employee then has to look at it and say, do I agree with this? How do I see it? Do I have a completely different view of this than my leader? Then okay, we for sure need to talk about that in our meeting. Whereas if we agree, when maybe there are other things we should focus on.
Yeah.
So I like very much that we actually show our employee also this before the dialogue.
Yes. And what I should also say here is, of course, when it's flicked over to the employee, they themselves can put a rating, and then the system will actually generate a gap, which is, of course, the exciting part, because then why is it that I see the moon from my angle and you see it from yours, and what's creating this gap, or behavioral wise or result wise, or whatever it is, right? But that's what can drive an interesting conversation.
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay, and then coming down here towards the end, there's some job goals here. So this is again back to how this particular template has been configured, right? And I think it's important to say that it could be configured in a lot of different ways, but here we're sort of looking at, okay, what are we then going to be focusing on?
Yeah, and here you then have the possibility of adding goals. And again, I would say, you know what, if you're not building a plan for a year, instead of choosing 10 goals you have to work with, choose 2 or 3 to focus on, and then see how you can lift those. Because my notion is that it becomes better if you focus on these things rather than wanting to do it all at once. So here you have the possibility of actually, free text writing what it is. So you again can use the lingo of your organization. You can use the goals and the competences you have already outlined in your strategy plan or when working with the department goals. So to make it most relevant as possible.
Yeah, and I think this is perhaps also the other part is that where is it that all these goals and agreement and where do they all sit? You know, what did we agree on? What was the target in perhaps both from a human perspective, but also from a delivery perspective. So I think it's quite smart to just have some quantifiable focus areas here that can be brought back to my personal profile page, which we'll cover in another conversation. But of course, sorry.
No, I was just going to say then it would also help you, as I said in the beginning, you know, that linking your leadership behavior to this process. So this is not something you're doing because you have to, but when you do the job goals like this, it actually becomes part of everyday leadership, because if you don't have the goals in here, you would have them somewhere else. So hopefully this is also a way of looking at how is it being a leader in the organization and making it as easy as possible to navigate in these different both platforms and processes, to make it as easy as possible to do your follow-up and to guide and coach your employees.
Yes. And then following on here, there's a section about development activities.
Yeah, so here you could say you have defined the goals already, and then a development activity could be that you need to learn a new system. You maybe need to be guided by a colleague. You need to attend a course. So some of the activities that can help you improve the competences that you need to improve on to help you reach your goals. So that is how I see this development activities, as being what it is we need to do in the meantime to make sure we actually focus on reaching this. And to me, this doesn't have to be only courses. I know like in the old days when we talk about competence development, it was very much about going to a course and how many courses can I get per year. But as it has become, you know, there's so much more blended learning. There's sitting with a coworker. There's going on things, you know, attending a different project. There's lots of things you can do that can be a development activity. So also when you talk to your leaders about this, challenge them a bit on what could a development activity be, because we have actually broad range to choose from. It doesn't have to be courses.
No. That's a very good point. So yeah, it follows same principle I just added in here. And then we talked about earlier on that the leaders comes in different shapes and forms. And so sometimes, you know, what is it that is top of mind inside of an organization? What is it that is important? What are some of the other topics that I perhaps should aim to have a conversation around with the employee? So in this example here, you know, we're just looking at, you know, the notion of that if you have 10 reports, direct reports, or even more, it's actually quite a lengthy process to go through all this. And I think in this day and age, we're also looking for simplified ways to still make it professional, but I don't have to kind of reinvent everything every single time. I guess the notion here is that, yes, I'd like to talk about something in relation to customer focus, or there's a couple of things strategy related.
Exactly. And I think what we did before when designing some of these processes was to build them in the process. So it would be like a mandatory step that you would have to talk about either the strategy or maybe working together. Then you would do the performance rating, then you would prepare, then you would have the dialogue. And as you say, it would become a very lengthy process. And I think now we also need to trust our leaders in saying, okay, we give you some sort of information about the process. We give you a platform where you can do it in an easy way, but you are the one who also knows your department the best. So of course you can also help decide on what is it I want to talk with employee A about. And of course that is different than I want to talk to employee B about. So again, shifting the accountability to both leaders and employees, and trusting them in saying, if we have done and designed this the right way, then of course they want to work with it and do a good process. And if they are not using it, if they are not seeing the value, then I would say it's rather HR that needs to look at, have we designed it the right way? I would much rather get a pull from the organization saying that, can we get more of this? Or can here, when you have the topics, I'm missing a topic because I always talk about teamwork or high performing teams. That's much better than me trying to force a lot of steps on them, I would say.
Yes. Okay, I mean, summarizing here, I mean, this is extremely interesting, and and I guess what we started out with was saying, is it possible to actually encompass both a process, a designed process that will give you overview of performance, and also give you sense of the talent pool available? And we also talked about this whole thing about the introduction and really getting that culture for performance improvement, or whatever the company is trying to aspire to. How do you set up a nice framework for that? So this whole introduction piece, getting the people that are driving, the faces that are responsible for making culture stick, or protecting it. And then we talked a little bit about these different sections that are derived out of the plan, the feedback with the commentary, the competency aspect. We talked about the possibility to pick from a library, and then make it clear in terms of what are the key job goals, and then here at the end, development activities and so forth. So in this case here, I'm as a manager, I'm done. I will finalize it, and it's now submitted, indicating to the employee that this is now ready for them to interact with. So we can see here that that this employee now is moved over to the different process step. And I think, at this point now, as we've talked about, the employee will then do their part. They will do their comments. They will look at the ratings. They will do their own ratings and so forth. So if we then sort of go back up into the helicopter, I guess what we're looking at here is then, when this happens, this process across hundreds of employees and perhaps thousands of employees, and we now are back at the corporate HR, what are some of the statistics and informations that HR are now empowered with, and what type of conversations can they fuel with other people that are responsible for, everybody says that human capital is the most important thing. So where does this lead us to now?
I think that for HR, you will get a great overview of the population of the organization. Where is it placed in the grid? And then based on that, as I said before, we would need to take some actions. And I think that is one of the key steps in making this part of everyday life, is that the actions or the outcome of the dialogue, because sometimes the dialogue becomes the goal in itself, but to really make it work and to also make it stick and to have some changes coming from it is also the action. So of course the leaders have to do their part, but we as HR, I would say, also need to follow up in terms of, so if we have people in the right hand corner, what do we then do from an organizational point of view in terms of looking at these high performers, high potentials? What is it we want to do to make sure that they have the challenges they need, that they feel that they're seen and heard? And the same with the low performers. How are we supporting our leaders in having these dialogues to make sure they're able to lift the performance? And then I would say in a general way, it also gives us an overview of the high performance of specific positions. As I mentioned before, we could go in and define specific setups for sales or customer service. So if we have departments we would like to compare against each other, we work in different countries and say we would like to compare sales in the Netherlands to sales in Norway, we would be able to do that. So it gives us some possibilities to take out some reports and to actually have the discussions with both the managers of the departments, but also with senior management, and say, we can see that there is much better performance in this department rather than this department. What do we do about that, and how is it maybe linked to sales figures? Again, the more commercial side of it and the business side, that HR is able to actually do some of that, to have these business case discussions with top management and saying, this is the outcome of the performance review process. We can see we need to take these steps from here. That can be something focusing on the talents, it can be something focusing on low performers, and it can be something focusing on different departments or various leaders maybe also. So I think that's quite crucial that we, both at HR, but also the leaders and top management, take the outcome of the process seriously.
Yeah, and I guess that starts with having some good data and having something that was no longer just stories and emotional reflection of or experiences, but actually having something solid to begin to qualified conversations.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, Pernille, I think in the next conversation, we will take a little bit more of a deep dive into what, following this Carolina lady that we looked at before, we in our next section will look at what does this then mean for her ongoing focus in terms of both corporate learning activities, compliance, and obviously the review or the appraisal or the assessment process that we just looked at. So that's to be covered in our next session. So for now, I'd like to thank you so much for this conversation and these great insights and experiences that you've had, that you could share with us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.